Nobody purchased just the print version. But it shows you in this very, very simple experiment how plastic, right, our preferences are, and how easy it is to influence us. So this in America, you know, a Toyota Prius, very common among people who are trying to be environmentally conscious and concerned about climate change. But this is sort of now an example of kind of how the spatial and temporal consequences that we don't think about, right? So when we buy our new Prius, we don't think about this, or this, or this. Right? We don't think about those things, those spatially separated consequences that are critical to the owning and operating of this vehicle. Same thing when people get their chicken nuggets. They don't think about this, right? A chicken factory. Or this a chicken deconstruction factory. When we buy our cell phones, we don't think about the niobium mine. And we don't think about the production facilities. So this is another example of some of the spatially separated consequences of our actions. We also don't tend to think about our endangered species friends and the implications on them. Or indigenous people, and we're losing these cultures faster than we're losing those species. And we don't think about things like this. In the US, this is a very interesting website, which you can go to, which was supported by the US State Department. And it's how many slaves, today still in the world, how many slaves are used in the production of the things, the services and goods that we buy to maintain our quality of life. And in the US, for the average quality of life, 30 to 40 slaves around the world are involved in creating the lifestyle that we enjoy. 30 to 40 slaves today. So how do we think about meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals when we have a situation like this? So now I give you maybe one last experiment. So say you take your shirt and you say to fold the shirt, and then fold it again, and then fold it again, and fold it again. That's 4 times, that's 5 times, that's 6 times. 7's a little bit hard for me with one hand. But imagine you just take a big piece of cloth and you fold it 32 times. And then you fold it once more and make it 33 times. So big piece of fabric. And you just keep folding it until you do it 33 times. How high would that be? Here, here, here. How high do you say? You know. How high do you think it would be? Who says maybe this high? 33 times. No? Higher or lower? Lower. Okay, so lower than this. Does anyone say higher than this? You say higher? How high? This high? Ceiling high? Higher than the ceiling? Second floor? As tall as the building? Not as tall as the building, but higher than the second floor. Anybody say taller than the building? Nobody says taller than the building. So it turns out it's actually much taller than the building. So that's how far. So from New York to Los Angeles. So the example of this is why we talk about, what are the core competencies to be at the foundation for learning for sustainability so we make much better decisions. This is the idea of exponential growth. And most people don't have an intuitive understanding of exponential growth. So when we see the growth of urban cities and urban areas, they're growing exponentially. But what's happening, it's much more significant than simply the exponential growth of population, is the exponential growth of consumption. So as soon as people get more money, they tend to first eat more meat. And then those consequences are spatially and temporally separated oftentimes. Then they purchase cars, and they purchase more consumer goods. And the growth rate of consumption is much faster than the growth rate in population. Because we're seeing the world's poor start to become richer and consume at a much, much faster rate. So this is sort of the underlying issues and challenges as we increase urbanization to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but virtually no one talks about these kinds of issues and challenges. And these are the things that I think we must talk about. So yes, Schumacher, a famous person who wrote Small is Beautiful, and he was actually the chief economist in the UK after World War II. He talked about this idea. Right, so why do we keep acting this way? It goes back to the same kind of question that Skinner asked. So now I'm going to talk about what's the solution to everyday illusion and delusion. It's what I call perception recalibration. So talking about the experiment with the shirt, that's a way to have our perceptions be recalibrated. So these are the ideas. Make what was invisible visible. We can talk about that. We can make that much clearer to people, the implications of their everyday actions. Learn how our perceptions can deceive us, right? And better understand the state of the planet. So 3 very key ideas to address illusion and delusion. Another aspect of the idea of illusion and delusion, right? Do we see the glass as half empty or half full? Maybe neither, maybe both. Right? The half empty side tends to see it in terms of challenge and scarcity. The half full sees it as abundance and opportunity. But really what we face in trying to meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals is both. It's both and. It's both abundance and opportunity. We live in a world which is incredibly rich and vibrant and full of wonder and tremendous resilience. But that resilience is also limited. And we have challenge and scarcity in meeting this desire to increase human development index while we lower ecosystem services drawn per capita. So I'm going to give another sort of little experiment here. If we look at social and ecological carrying capacity in terms of exceeded and living within means, and we look at technology in the vertical axis, sort of a technological optimism view or technological pessimism view. And then we look at movies. I'm trying to give an example of what kinds of sort of cultural artifacts do we have. This is passive social learning in the work I do on social learning. What messages does society send us, right? Well, we have lots of movies here. Right, lots of sort of dystopian movies. People who are older maybe remember this one. Then we have a few here, right? Star Trek. So it's a technological, optimistic view and a strong, democratic government. And then we have some very tragic dystopian stories here, right? Where society crashes. Maybe you've seen this new movie, right? Some people recognize it. But the issue and challenge is, so what goes there? And I challenge you. I have a very good friend who's a movie producer who did lots of movies like Silence of the Lambs, and I asked him, do we have any movies that fit here? And nobody that I know can think of a movie that fits here. So the question again is, going back to Skinner, why isn't more being done? Well, what we model to our children, what we model to society, we model these 3 options of the world. We don't model a vision of the world that improves quality of life for all with low draw on ecosystem services. It's democratic, people have joy and wonder and delight. Okay, so this is the second problem or challenge. It's called mismanaging change. This is Jay Forrester, who wrote a lot about systems dynamics. And he gave lots of examples of why that challenge exists. And I'm just going to talk about it in terms of two ideas, first order change and second order change. First order change is when the appropriate solutions come from within the existing system structure. So when we're driving and we're trying to text, it's very dangerous, right? It doesn't make any sense. So the easy thing to do is don't text while we drive. Pretty straightforward. It's within the existing system structure. Second order change is what we call transformative, right? So the solutions happen outside the existing system structure. And we break down the existing system. That's how we get second order change. So what do you think this is an example of? First order change or second order change? That's a first order solution strategy, right? Add more wires. This is after Katrina. So the first order solution strategy here was build more dikes and don't maintain them. First order solution strategy here is, right, add more lanes. That'll solve that problem. What would a second order solution strategy be? Reimagine the transportation system. Right, so that's a second order solution. And I'm going to talk some more about second order solutions. This is what Albert Einstein said. So first order change is being less unsustainable. It's like what happens when in China you build a Three Gorges Dam so that you could have control of water and also generate some electricity so you didn't have a few extra coal-fired power plants. But growth is happening so fast that even the electricity from Three Gorges, the biggest dam in the world, doesn't make much of a difference. So second order change is becoming net positive, or this idea of improving quality of life for all. Right, it's getting into this area. Okay, so if we look at this, what's the solution to mismanaging change? It's matching the change strategy to the character of the problem. So it's taking the problem space, which if you look at the UN gap, the UN gap looks at the problem space very well now, right? It talks about the significance of learning, it talks about the significance of transformative change. The Millennium Development Goals, as they transfer to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, they're all very good. The problem is, the solution space that's being proposed doesn't make any sense for the scale and character of the problems that we have. So there's a giant mismatch, another form of a gap between the problem space and the solution space. This is what we need to do. But it's difficult, and the challenges are big. So this is the idea of what's called the positive deviant. Right? These guys, they're trying to carry this stone uphill. And then this one person realizes, oh, it's pretty easy if you just rotate it 90 degrees and push it up. That's the kind of insight we need to bring the problem space and the solution space together. Here are a few quotes on the positive deviant idea. This is Janine. I'm going to give a few examples now of people who are focusing on second order change. Janine Benyus, who's the author of Biomimicry, she talks about the idea of muscles. How do muscles glue themselves to a rock in cold, salty water with tremendous hydraulic pressure? How do they do something like that? When they create a glue that's totally non-toxic and biodegradable and stronger than any glue we've ever created. Why don't we start thinking like that? That's a second order solution. All our glue is non-toxic, happens at room temperature chemistry, and is completely biodegradable. Imagine if we had a glue like that. So these are termites who cool themselves with this cooling tower. Engineers know about this concept. But it can also be applied to buildings, to keep the building cool passively. You've probably seen these before. But if you made the connection between that, right, that's Velcro. Here's Dennis Hayes. He's the father of Earth Day in the U.S. in 1970 and also 1990. But he also runs a foundation in Seattle called the Polar Foundation. And he's done some very important work. He built, this is the first living building challenge commercial building in the United States in Seattle, Washington. It's a building that produces more energy than it uses. It's not attached to a storm sewer. It's not attached to waste. And all the water comes from on site. So this is a second order building, a building that models sustainability in all aspects. And I'll talk more about it. This is from inside. It's also a beautiful space that improves worker productivity. So if you look at the 30-year life cycle of a building, only 2% is the design and construction, 6% is operation and maintenance, and 92% comes from the salaries and benefits of those employed in the building. When we look at urban societies, we're going to see a giant turnover in buildings by 2035. More than 50% of the buildings are going to be replaced or new buildings are going to be created. So the idea here is that if you have a 1% improvement in worker productivity, you get a 25% increase in design and construction. So you increase the worker productivity part here, and that gives you an extra 1% in design and construction to move that from 2% to 3%. And this building only cost 25% more. And that got 43% more increase. So you'd have extra money over. Here's another example of second order change, Wangari Maathai. So we're talking about people who have a lot of experience in forestry. And she actively worked on the Greenbelt movement in Kenya. Another example is Jaime Lerner, who wrote a book which I recommend to all of you. He was the mayor of Curitiba. Is that on here? There. He was the mayor of Curitiba in Brazil, and then the governor of Paraná in Brazil. He became very famous for the kinds of solution-oriented approaches. He was trained in urban planning, the solution-oriented approaches to the challenges that people were facing that were very, very cost-effective. I encourage you to sort of look up the story about how they did this without creating a very expensive MRT system, right? They just used buses, which are much, much cheaper. This is a person who's looked at the work in terms of food, a famous chef called Dan Barber in the US, who wrote a brilliant book called The Third Plate. He was asked to give a talk about this fish, which was supposed to be a sustainably harvested fish. And then he started to ask some questions about, well, what does that fish eat? What's the ratio of food to usable protein? And he found out that the fish actually get fed 25% chicken. And he said, well, I don't think that's sustainable, so he took it off his menu. And then he learned about a Spanish fish farm with some different kinds of fish, fish that's like a bass. And he learned about how that was being produced with traditional practices. And the people who produce this fish don't feed it anything. So it only eats what's naturally there in its ecosystem. And the ecosystem is so productive that every day flamingos fly from 200 kilometers away to eat the fish and the shrimp and the other foods the fish eat. So they judge the productivity of this ecosystem. How productive is this? Is it working well? Does it make sense? They judge it by the fact that they can harvest their fish with no extra cost for food, and that the flamingos come from 200 miles away. So they judge that the flamingos eat about 20% of the protein sources that the fish would eat. But they think that's good, not bad, because it means that the ecosystem is healthy and flourishing. So again, it's a second order change approach, a different way of looking at these challenges. This is what Professor Ye mentioned. to ACU-PCC. It's a commitment by university college presidents to make their university zero net carbon. Imagine the kinds of learning opportunities that happen throughout campus when you make a commitment to have your campus become zero net carbon. This is one thing my president is a part of the steering committee for ACU-PCC. These are two colleagues of mine from Harvard, and I just gave a talk out there in June and worked closely with them on the idea of net positive enterprise. What does it mean to be a net positive enterprise that contributes to quality of life for all? And I encourage you to look at some of their work on handprinting in their organization called Shine. So both of the solution strategies that I'm talking about address the human potential for learning and experimentation, right? We need to do things that are messy and get our hands dirty, not just talk about theory, but actually be involved in the change process. To address change mismanagement and to address this issue of illusion and delusion, we need to get our hands very, very, very dirty and work with our students on real-world problems. We shouldn't stop working on theory. The theory is very important, but we need to work on the theory in relationship to problem solving and improving quality of life for all. And that there's a social contract, I'm arguing, if we're talking about addressing the challenges that we're facing with increased urbanization, we as professors have a responsibility to the public, which supports us doing our work to address these real-world problems that are facing us all. So we need to sort of leverage our human capacities into capabilities, into competencies, and also into expertise. Photo of Oxford. So what have we done in the last 500 years in higher education? We've generated tremendous amounts of data, information, and knowledge. And where we've really fallen is on meaning, understanding, and wisdom. So this is another form of gap that I was talking about, right? So we have a global action plan, but we have another gap in terms of what we do in higher education. Data, information, and knowledge, and the separation between meaning, understanding, and wisdom. Again, it depends upon the earlier slide about the glass half full or the glass half empty, right? One way we could look at this is, it's a horrible challenge, we're just not up to it. The other way to look at it is a tremendous opportunity. It's a tremendous, exciting opportunity for all of us who are professors, and especially all of you who are students who are going to help change the world. So let's look at what do we mean by education. There's a socialization function, there's a vocational function, there's a liberal humanist function, and again we go back to this idea of a transformative function. And this is from the work of Stephen Sterling, a colleague of mine that had an international project on core competencies in learning for sustainability. So if we're going to realize the UN Sustainable Development Goals, well, we really need to focus on the transformative function. So that's what I'm going to talk about. This is from a project at the ASHE, the American Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. This is one of my PhD students. We did a project on core competencies in learning for sustainability, a big workshop, where we introduced a lot of survey options with people's cell phone. And we tried to sort of get an understanding of what people meant by core competencies, what were the core competencies in learning for sustainability that they outlined. How does that relate to a big literature review that we did for a year? So I'll just summarize a little bit of that. This is from the work of Arnhem Week, and he came up with 5 different core competencies based upon expert-based surveys from US and a few from around the world. And he argued that their main core competencies were systems thinking, anticipatory thinking, normative thinking, strategic thinking, and interpersonal. Those were the 5 core competencies. And then we spent a lot of time doing another gap analysis in terms of what we thought were really critical, and we came up with these. So we argued that there was something that we call affinity for all life. And we have much more detail. If you go back and you read, what does this actually mean? Very, very, not just simple, but simplistic. For systems thinking, we need life cycle competency, resilient competence. And they have, strangely, twice. Resilience, competence, resilience, competence. One is competency, one is competence. So, to me, I felt like they really didn't do much sophisticated thought in terms of what would that mean for us in terms of developing programs or developing curriculum. We tried to be a lot more thoughtful, and this is part of the international project I'm working on with people from around the world, is to develop these competencies so they can be tied to the development of programs and whole university structures around these ideas. So we have affinity for all life, state of the planet knowledge, wise decision making, modeling sustainable behavior, and transformative social change. And then we came up, if you can see down there at the bottom right corner, I realized through a bunch of work that we did with colleagues this summer from around the world is we missed the idea of mindfulness. I worked with Dan Goldman a little bit. You may know of some of the work he's done on ecological intelligence and emotional intelligence. And the idea of mindfulness we're really leaving out. It's key to actually supporting not just transformative social change, but it ties the action to reflection so that we can actually continuously improve and tie our sort of philosophical learning to our practical, real-world problem solving. So what we see is that I argue that there are sort of two streams in thinking. This one is consistent with first-order change and making the world less unsustainable. This one is stream two. It's what I call in a new article I'm finishing up on visions of sustainability. It's sort of a robust sustainability approach that's consistent with second-order change. And we see when we look at the world of the literature of core competencies, it basically fits into two camps with a little bit of work in between. But mostly there's kind of a bifurcation. This focuses on making the world less unsustainable. This focuses on the transformative change. So the question is really, what would it look like if we created learning for sustainability core competencies that were up to our call for transformative species scale change? And I argue that maybe we make a mix of the two. And someone who did a great amount of work in this area is Danella Meadows. I'll let you read that a little bit. Danella Meadows unfortunately passed away about 10 years ago. She was one of the authors, if you've read The Limits to Growth, she was one of the key authors of the Limits to Growth study. And she was, I think, one of the most wise and sophisticated of academics who actually, she left academia and created an intentional community in farming. So she took all of her knowledge of systems learning and tied it to practical, real-world problem solving. So her idea is, right, we have to actually live as if we know it. We have to embrace the principles in all aspects of our lives. So she wrote a very famous article that's online about 12 steps in terms of ways to intervene in the system. This is the most important idea, right? The power to transcend paradigms. That's the second order change idea. Transcending of paradigms. So she distilled 35 years of her work in systems modeling and systems thinking into this paper, which is a very, very important paper that I encourage you all to read. Okay, so to leverage the transformative potential of education, this is my hypothesis, right? We don't reorient higher education as UNESCO has talked about. We need to reimagine higher education. Because higher education is also where we do the teacher training, right? And we train the teachers, and if we train them towards reorientation, that's what they'll do. And if we just reorient them, we're going to get nominal sustainability in a world that's less unsustainable than we have today. We're not going to get a reimagined form of education that leads to second order change and transformative change that really improves quality of life for all and is up to the challenge of addressing the increased urbanization that we're having all around the world. So I argue that we need to do three things. Certainly we need to change the content, right, what we teach. But we also need to talk about pedagogy, how we teach what we teach. We need to have students be involved in real-world problem solving, not just theoretical case studies of people who solve problems. Because they won't be able to do it. And there's no wonder why they won't